hello, very beautiful community. We are talking MAGA influencers being infiltrated by Russia. And we're going to go two directions here. We're going to go a bit deeper than the commentaries you've heard over the last day or two into how this fits with Russian malign interference in our democracies and the workings of Russian propaganda. But I'm also going to speak to you in my capacity as a minor public intellectual who uses the YouTube platform about exactly how things descended to that level of entrepreneurial grift, right? This is a platform whose workings I understand, and I understand the motivations of people operating on it, both from a vantage point of integrity and from a vantage point of collapse of integrity. Now, we'll start by reading a little bit from the DOJ website from a couple of days ago. Then we'll look briefly at the indictment itself, and then we'll get into the substance of our conversation together. So let's get on with this. DOJ a couple of days ago. An indictment charging Russian nationals Konstantin Kalashnikov, Kostya, and Elena Afanasieva, surname to pronounce for most people, known as Lena, charging these folks with conspiracy to violate FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. The Justice Department, this is a quote from Attorney General Merrick Garland, has charged 2 employees of RT, a Russian state-controlled media outlet, in a $10 million scheme to create and distribute content to US audiences with hidden Russian propaganda messaging. The Justice Department will not tolerate attempts by an authoritarian regime to exploit our country's free exchange of ideas in order to covertly further its propaganda efforts, and our investigation into this matter is ongoing. According to the court documents, RT, formerly known as Russia Today, is a state-controlled media outlet funded and directed by the government of Russia. Over at least the past year, RT and its employees, including Kalashnikov and Afanasieva, deployed nearly $10 million to covertly finance and direct a Tennessee-based online content company, US Company One. I won't be naming as many names as other commentators have here, names that aren't named in the indictment itself, but these are all names that are going to be familiar to you if you've been following the news, and these are allegedly 2 Canadians who founded this company that got paid allegedly by RT and then paid MAGA influencers on various platforms to share talking points that happen to resemble messaging that the Kremlin likes. So $10 million deployed to covertly finance and direct a Tennessee-based online content creation company. In turn, the company published English language videos on multiple platforms. Let's just jump briefly into the indictment itself. After Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, RT was sanctioned. So I'm just reading from the indictment now. RT, in response, created, in the words of its editor-in-chief, an empire of covert projects designed to shape public opinion in Western audiences. One of these covert projects is its funding of a Tennessee-based online content creation company, US Company One. RT and its employees, including Kalashnikov and Afanasieva, the defendants, deployed nearly $10 million, laundered through a network of foreign shell entities to covertly fund and direct US Company Number One. Many of the videos published by this company contain commentary on events and issues in the United States. While the views expressed in the videos are not uniform, the subject matter of the videos is often consistent with the government of Russia's interest in amplifying US domestic divisions in order to weaken US opposition to core government of Russia interests, such as the ongoing war in Ukraine. in December 2022, company founder one began working with an individual operating under a fictitious name, Edward Grigorian. Now, I won't give you the full reading here, other than to say that Mr. Grigorian is a fictional character. A transparently fictional character whose CV is provided here. And anybody who reads that CV should suspect that this person doesn't exist, especially in 2024, where it's extraordinarily difficult to imagine somebody donating 10 million bucks while being untraceable on the internet. So suspicions arose with the founders articulating the fact that one of the commentators they were paying was insisting on seeing more about this guy. Doesn't exist. That's when the fake CV was generated, and that allegedly allayed the concerns. The indictment goes on to say that the founders were aware they were being paid from Russia while waiting for a reply around invoices. Founder one searched what was the current time in Moscow. I'll read you one last bit because it's significant. Afanasieva, who we've just mentioned, privately messaged Founder One on Discord in March 2024, asking that one of the commentators, one of the creators, record something about the Moscow terror attack, emphasizing a Ukrainian link, for which there was no evidence at the time, and there isn't any evidence now. Quote, I think we can focus on the US-Ukraine angle. Founder One responded that they would ask commentator 3, and we know the names of these commentators, but I won't be naming most of them here, and that eventually commentator 3 said they're happy to do it, they're happy to provide the content. That gives you a flavor for a more systematic presentation of the indictment. Watch Ryan Macbeth's video, and if you're watching this on the chat channel on YouTube, I'll link Ryan's video below. Ryan goes further than me in making a case against these commentators as potentially knowing what they were doing. At least Ryan does this by raising rhetorical questions. Ryan's one of the best explainers on YouTube, and his video will be below. So to begin thinking about this properly, we've got to ground ourselves in the 4 pillars of how Russian propaganda works. So let's do that now. The first pillar of Russian propaganda is doubt about truth itself, right? It exploits our desire not to get duped by politics, and in the process gets us to doubt everything about politics, and eventually doubt the possibility of even acquiring truthful beliefs about politics. So this is very, very important. The method is to exploit a crisis of trust whereby people are desperate for the truth and worried they can't trust anything, to get them to a place where they don't end up being better informed, but instead simply give up on the idea that sense can be made of the world, right? And end up in a place where every interpretation potentially looks equally compelling. Pillar 2 of Russian propaganda is foregoing of consistency, right? Making a set of contradictory claims about the same event. Pillar 3 of Russian propaganda is saturation of the informational environment, telling many alternate stories about one and the same event. Pillar 4 of Russian propaganda is very essential here, and that's what I call motivational internality. And think of this as the maxim that a person is only going to be motivated by what already motivates them. So it's not trying to change your ideology, it's trying to get you to spin out of control via your own ideological logic. And here, if we look at the intent of getting these commentators to articulate in a wider and more intense way Russian propaganda talking points, the intent here isn't to persuade these people of something they don't believe, but to notice that these people are anyway reciting messages that look like Russian propaganda, and then trying to get them to recite them more widely and maybe intensify the way they recite them. And now we've got to make a very important point. The harm Russian propaganda seeks to do to Western democracies is what I call DIY harm. Russian propaganda is unreasonably effective because it tries to trigger a self-destructive response in us. A response on our part which we should avoid if we want to save our democracies. What they want us to do is freak out about the interference in a way that does even more damage than the interference itself. And so this is a very, very important point. The point ultimately for Russian propaganda is to make our democracies ungovernable. It's not to take particular sides. They take particular sides, and we'll come to why they take Trump's side in a moment. But the point of taking sides is to generate a situation of ungovernability in our democracies. We'll come back to why this really, really matters in the way this story pans out. Before doing so, let's quickly mention Russia and MAGA. What is the Kremlin's position on Trump? So the Kremlin, in my assessment, prefers Trump in 2024 the way it didn't in 2016. In 2016, the Kremlin fell for the mainstream illusion that Trump couldn't win. And so they wanted to use Trump as a wrecking ball to undermine the presidency of Hillary Clinton, who they thought was going to win inevitably. So Trump was a wrecker, not the winning candidate to support in 2016 for Russia. In 2024, they do support Trump. But it's a bit more nuanced than this, in my view. So the Kremlin feel, I think, that 80% of the time a Trump presidency will work out in their favor. But they also feel that Trump is extreme and unpredictable. Putin's analysis of Trump is in fact accurate. He sees Trump as a populist, clownish buffoon who failed, while being a communicative genius, but who failed to generate an elite around him in his first term, and thereby ended up having policies that Putin regards as actually being tougher on Russia than Obama was. And as a result of that, the Russians don't quite know where they stand with Trump. So they think that 80 or 90% of the time Trump will work out in their favor, but they think that there could also be extreme scenarios, an extremely favorable and an extremely unfavorable scenario. They think that virtually all the extremely favorable scenarios to Russia will be generated only if Trump is in power. But they also feel there is a chance that the extremely unfavorable scenarios will also be generated by Trump. They think there's a chance that Trump could be tougher on Russia and more supportive of Ukraine than Kamala Harris will. I'm skeptical about this Russian interpretation, but it is what they think. So they're unconfident about Trump, but they know that in the vast majority of the time, as far as their read of the situation goes, Trump will be favorable to them and they support Trump. They also think that US democratic decline is inexorable and that a Harris administration will anyway end up being weak and inadvertently favorable to them too. So that's the picture the Russians are sitting with. So what we've got here is that it's not just that there might be damage done to US democracy through pro-Kremlin talking points being amplified by this RT-driven infiltration enterprise. It's also possible that US democracy will be weakened by the fallout from this incident, however it turns out. That's to say that it's a functional benefit in terms of how Russian propaganda works, that the fallout from this incident could do more damage than the sort of distribution of this content may have done in of itself. That's to say, let me get to the point a bit more articulately here, these folks getting caught may potentially be favorable to the Kremlin, because them getting caught could generate more polarization in our democracy. And here we've got to be careful that we don't create deeper polarization, a greater loss of trust, in the way that we, pro-democratic institution Westerners, react to these grifters and entrepreneurs in the MAGA sphere. So watch out for that. Watch out for people who are on your side inadvertently falling into the arms of Russian propaganda by reacting to this destructively. For instance, by overreaching, right? And describing toxic organic political enterprises that are domestic to US politics, and describing them as being completely non-domestic, completely inorganic, and simply an expression of Russian interference. You see, so this is very, very important to tread carefully, because there's a risk that your monkey-like dance, oh, look at all of these Russian agents, is actually what Russian propaganda wants you to do. And now let's get closer to commenting on exactly how things worked for these folks peddling these messages and getting paid for them. One excuse offered here is an excuse I want to bat away without giving that bat away any justification. And that's the excuse that these people don't matter, they're just doing a little bit of online entertainment, doesn't really harm anybody. No, I'm sorry, millions of people watch folks like Tim Pool, and therefore this is serious, this does damage. It shouldn't be exaggerated, this damage, but we can't say that it's just innocent online entrepreneurial game playing. It actually does damage to democracy. The very worst example of this content is perhaps a clip that you can widely see now from Tim Pool, where he says Ukraine is the #1 enemy of the United States and we should apologize to Russia. Now, a key question here is, to what extent can you trace a divergence, an inflection in the messaging of this content creator after, right, he entered into this contractual setup with this content company that was being funded by RT. And you've got to go slow with this, right? It may be that there isn't much of a difference in Tim Pool's messaging before and after. It may be that there is some difference. That needs to be researched and looked at. What did these folks, so not the founders of the media company, but the commentators who were being paid, what do they know and what should they have known? Let's talk about this. First question, will they suffer as a result, and will they reflect on what they were doing as a result? Now, let me put it like this. The idea that your message has been shown to overlap with Russian state propaganda does not mean that you're necessarily wrong, but it should give you a lot of pause for thought. Will it give them pause for thought? In my opinion, no. Will they be punished by their own audience for this? Will their audience turn away, having realized that they have been compromised in this way, in this spectacularly humiliating way, as we'll see in a moment? No. And that's because the level of polarization is so great that these content creators already treat their domestic opponents as enemies. And if your domestic opponents are enemies, being implicated in a transaction, perhaps an indirect transaction with an enemy state, will not turn these audiences off, because they already see their domestic opponents, Democrats, capital D, as enemies of a certain kind. So we've already got such a deep politics of enemies instead of a politics of opponents, right? A relationship of opposition is a relationship of cooperation. An opponent today could be an ally tomorrow. But this profound relationship of enemies domestically will mean their audiences will not turn away, and therefore I do not see these people as experiencing any career setbacks from this in all likelihood. An important point about how entrepreneurialism and grift works. Do not separate too sharply convenience from sincerity. If something is especially convenient, human beings who do not have profound integrity and profound psychological stability will start to drift in such a way that they anyway begin to sincerely believe what is convenient for them to believe. So it's not, are they saying this because they mean it, versus are they saying because they're getting paid for it? It's they mean what they're saying because they're getting paid for it. Let's look at this a little bit from sort of my expertise in content production on the platform of YouTube. Tim Pool has claimed that the money they were getting paid, and in some of their cases we're talking about 100,000 per video, or 400,000 per a month with 4 videos. Tim Pool has claimed that that money is below market value. Now, what do I think of this as somebody who knows how this works? I think that claim is ludicrous. I'll say something about my own extraordinarily conservative approach to how I operate on the platform. But before saying that, let me say that if you're doing a podcast and you're trying to maximally milk cash from sponsorships, you're doing an hour-long podcast, you're putting in, let's say, 3 adverts, and the podcast gets 100,000 views. How much money could you expect to get? 100,000 views, hour-long podcast, 3 advertisements. $3,000? $2,000? $4,000? Not $100,000. So we're talking about sums of money that have nothing to do with the reality of this business. And that should make you suspicious, unless you're going out of your way not to get suspicious about what's going on when such sums of money are being offered to you. Under what circumstances, were to be generous, could somebody like Tim Pool be seen to be receiving 100,000 per video in a way that makes sense? Let's try to even sort of see if this is a conceivable scenario. I suppose if a very wealthy philanthropist who you could trace and you could clearly gauge as being responsible, might not have the views we would like, it might be some kind of a MAGA philanthropist, but let's say it's some kind of a convinced anti-constitutional US-based conservative who wants to give this money. Under what circumstance could this amount of money make sense? Only if Tim Pool were told, Tim, produce a 20-minute long video essay, but you must do all the work on it. You can't outsource any editing, and you must spend 50 to 80 hours editing this video. And you must do all the work, all the scripting, all the image finding, all the editing, everything. Because if you begin to outsource it, obviously you could do it much cheaper, but Tim Pool, a big influencer, presumably your hourly rate should be expensive. You could I suppose, get to 100 grand if you are Tim Pool and you were told by this conservative philanthropist that you had to put in all the work yourself for that video. So you're going to spend 80 hours making it. Suppose you could charge £1 grand per hour. And that's kind of the only scenario under which you could conceivably get 100 grand. But that's not what we're talking about. Moreover, these videos on the channel of that company, right, were being shared there, we're getting 5,000 to 10,000 views. Not 100,000, not 200,000, not 500,000. Sometimes even less, sometimes 1,000 views. So something really doesn't add up here in the financial model, to the point that anybody who is remotely open to being suspicious should have been deeply suspicious and keen to investigate what's going on, if that's the offer being made to them. And I think it'll be helpful for context if I shared a little bit about my own journey of negotiating the ethics of sharing on the YouTube platform as a minor public intellectual whose video commentaries have got perhaps 30+ million views in the last couple of years, last two plus years. And that means talking about two things. What are your ethics around interacting with anybody who wants you to either talk about something or wants you to share something, whether it's for money or for free, right? That's one issue. The second issue is just around models of contribution from your own community, from your own audience. Let's start with the second bit first. For the first year of my regular sharing on YouTube, I had YouTube ads completely off. There is a video on the main channel about Alexander Dugan, which is worth mentioning because it's the first video in which I ventilated the theme that we're actually discussing right now. That is the theme of folks in our culture dressed in conservative clothes who aren't real conservatives at all, but are cultural revolutionaries wanting to break the democratic game. Very different to a conservative in 1985 who may want to maintain institutions, maintain various kinds of traditions we've inherited rather than breaking them. So we've got toxic entrepreneurialism that is anti-democratic dressed up as conservatism. So this is one of the democratic deformations in our society. And don't get me wrong, there are clear deformations in the center and on the left of politics too. But the major deformation on the right is anti-constitutional conservatives who want to break the democratic game. I spoke about that first, I think, in that video. And that video has got maybe 700,000 to 800,000 views. Ads were turned off, which means that only cups of coffee that came through the thanks button people could press in the comment section, that was the only financial contribution that video was able to receive. And I earned approximately $80 to $90 for that video that got 700,000 to 800,000 views. Over the last year, I have had a very minimal and conservative approach to having ads that YouTube runs on my videos. I turn off all ads mid-video because, particularly on the chat channel, I am passionate about sharing a space in time, turning up in the same room and just sitting there, almost in a way that matters beyond what we say. Just that ritual of turning up, which means that if we talk for 9 minutes, I don't want a instant soup ad on minute 6. Many of you won't see it because you subscribe to YouTube, which means you don't see any ads. But some of you would see it. And indeed, even beyond the coffee cups ad revenue, it would probably help to push the video in the algorithm because YouTube likes videos with ads. But it's important not to break that presence together for us, for me. At the beginning of videos, I turn off non-skippable ads, but there are skippable ads at the beginning of my videos now on the chat channel and on the main channel. Because many of the main channel videos take me 50 hours of work, my average income over the last year, and I could be wrong about this, per hour of work I put into the main channel is about $2 an hour. Right, compare that with what alternate exchange of time for money I could have instead of this exchange via the auto placed ads on the YouTube platform. On the chat channel, per chat, what you see is tens of bucks, often low tens of bucks. So we're talking about me sitting here with a disability, not being well enough to cook lunch, and I can order a lunch takeaway for $1 from a chat video. Now that's an extremely conservative approach, and it's absolutely not the right approach for most creators. But I'm sharing it to give you that context. I do also have a Patreon platform where a good number of members of the community contribute cups of coffee or several cups of coffee on a monthly basis. I haven't taken any sponsorship adverts, even when they've come from really sound enterprises such as Ground News or whatever is the typical stuff that's often bombarded into your inbox. Not because of a puritanism about this, I don't have a puritanism about this, but because on balance, my sense so far has been that that's been the best thing for the sacredness of our space. Let's now talk about perhaps the more important issue of interaction with others, and I'll just give you one example. Everybody in this info bubble tends to get some messages from United 24, which is a media paid for by the Ukrainian state. Now, one thing a creator could do is have some kind of a contractual or financial interaction with United 24. That would obviously be egregious and completely inappropriate for me. But I'm going to go further. No relationship would be appropriate for me with United 24, speaking about it as an example. Even if they shared a picture of a field with me, they just emailed me a picture of a field in Ukraine because it was blue and it had sunflowers. And they said, look, gorgeous representation in nature of the Ukrainian flag. Wouldn't it be lovely if you just put it on your community post? No contract, no financial transaction. My answer is no to a picture of a field shared without any financial transaction attached to it, without any contractual transaction attached to it. The only exception would be is if I saw that picture and I thought that somehow it was significant to make an analysis of it. And if I thought that was justified independently, then I would make an analysis of that picture and then say, oh, by the way, I'm aware of this picture because it got emailed to me by United 24. So that's the position. Contrast that, right? Not sharing a picture of a field casually with receiving $100 per video that gets virtually no views, $100,000, without being systematically interested in where that money is coming from. So imagine that extraordinary gulf. And let me land now with a very important point that's not been properly emphasized about these creators. There's been much talk about these creators being toxic for democracy or them being entrepreneurial in a way that exploits moments of moment in our divisive and polarized discourse. I want to go further. These creators have an abusive relationship not just with the rest of the information environment, but with their own audience. They are triggering their audience's fears, their audience's compulsive instincts. You remember how we talk about me sort of articulating this idea in a nauseatingly repetitive way about it being a matter of digestive health, how we approach content, right? What's put into your tummy and how does it feel for you the next day? These folks are putting junk food that's plastic instead of vegetables into the tummy of their audience. A misanthropic interpretation could be to say, well, the audience deserves that because they're biting the bait, they're buying that stuff. That's a view. It's a legitimate view, but it's not mine. My view is that humans are complex and humans have different sides. And a human that is compulsively ingesting junk food on a Tuesday could somehow be opened up to be made to feel more open epistemically, to be made to be receptive to a healthier kind of food rather than that plastic. So these folks aren't just engaged in an entrepreneurial enterprise caught up in audience capture and algorithms. They're engaged in an unhealthy enterprise with their own audience. Their relationship with their own audience sucks. The quality of what their own audience gets from them sucks. That's an important point to make too when we think about how we answer the question of, how could everybody in the informational space that is so difficult and is so unregulated and is so difficult in all of its inhibition and polarization to reconcile with healthy democratic discourse, if we think about how all the actors in that space could make the space healthier, right? When we think about that, we have to notice that there's a kind of abusive relationship some of these folks have, even with their own audiences. Thank you so much for being with me. Lots of love.